It was Christmas Eve when Officer Ethan Cole and his K-9, Ranger, heard a faint cry echoing from an abandoned cabin beneath the mountain. Inside, they found a pair of tiny pink gloves and a child's diary signed Emma Parker, the girl who vanished exactly 1 year ago. As snow began to fall harder, Ethan realized the trail didn't end there. It led straight to a secret no one in town was ready to face. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in miracles. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. The wind howled across Snowvale, Montana, slicing through the night like shards of glass. Snow fell in relentless waves, blanketing every rooftop, tree, and trail in ghostly white. Christmas lights flickered weakly on porches already buried half their height in drifts. The only sound that dared to interrupt the blizzard's roar was the steady crunch of boots and the rhythmic panting of a dog. Officer Ethan Cole, 35, moved through the swirling snow with the calm focus of a man who no longer feared the cold. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his once boyish face now weathered by grief. A faint scar curved beneath his left eye, the only visible mark of the night that had taken his daughter, Lily, 2 Christmases ago. He never spoke of it, but every December, the same quiet ache settled into his bones. His dark navy uniform was dusted white, his gloves stiff with frost, and his breath came out in short bursts of vapor. Walking a few paces ahead was Ranger, his partner, a 6-year-old German shepherd, black and silver coat thick against the cold. Ranger's gait was purposeful, his amber eyes alert. He was larger than most of his breed, with a faint notch missing from his right ear, a scar from his service days on the border unit. The dog was loyal, disciplined, and carried a strange intuition that sometimes made Ethan wonder if he still heard things beyond the human world. Tonight, Ranger's nose twitched as if it had caught something invisible in the wind. They had been on patrol for hours, checking empty roads and cabins after the storm warning. The town's edges blurred into wilderness here. Where the paved road ended, Snowvale became a sea of pines and old timber houses built long before electricity came to the valley. Ethan tightened his coat and squinted into the storm. "Come on, boy," he muttered through his scarf. "Let's call it a night." But Ranger didn't move. The dog froze, head lifting sharply. His ears pricked. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, a streak of gray against the white. "Ranger, heel!" Ethan shouted, his voice vanishing into the blizzard. The officer broke into a run, his boots sinking into knee-deep snow. Ranger darted through a line of birch trees and disappeared down a narrow slope. When Ethan finally caught up, his flashlight beam fell upon a shape, a cabin, half buried under snow at the base of the ridge. The house looked ancient, its roof sagging beneath layers of frost, one shutter hanging by a single hinge. Icicles clung to the eaves like frozen daggers. It was the kind of place locals whispered about, a leftover from another century, forgotten even by maps. Ranger stood near the front porch, nose pressed to the doorframe, whining softly. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Easy, boy." He stepped onto the creaking porch and pushed the door open. It groaned like something alive. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and cold ash. Broken furniture leaned against the walls, and the faint smell of mold mixed with something older, maybe candle wax or faint traces of smoke from a long-dead fire. Ethan's flashlight cut across the room, catching glints of glass, cobwebs, and shadows that seemed to breathe. Ranger moved first, his nails clicking softly on the wooden floor, tail low, body tense but calm. Then, in the beam of the flashlight, something small. A pair of pink gloves lay on the floor near an overturned chair. They were delicate, child-sized, the wool still faintly soft as if recently handled. Next to them, under a thin veil of snow that had drifted in through a cracked window, was a small blue book. Ethan crouched down, brushing off the frost. The leather cover was cracked and worn. He turned it over and read the faintly embossed letters. Emma Parker. His chest tightened. He knew that name. The Parker girl from Milford, the next town over. She'd gone missing exactly 1 year ago, on Christmas Eve. Every volunteer in 3 counties had searched for weeks. The case had gone cold in the storm. He opened the diary slowly. The first page was written in looping, innocent handwriting. Today is Christmas. The snow is so pretty. I wish someone would come, so I won't be alone anymore. The words blurred for a moment as Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He could almost hear Lily's voice, his daughter's voice, echoing faintly through those words. For a long while, he just sat there, the wind whispering through the cracked boards, Ranger sitting beside him like a silent sentinel. A few pages later, a pressed flower, a daisy faded to the color of bone, slipped free and landed on the floor. Ethan stared at it. It felt impossible that something so fragile could have survived this long in a place so cold. He looked around again. There were no recent footprints, no heat, no sign of anyone living here. But the diary, it was too intact. It hadn't been buried for a year. It had been left recently. Ranger's ears perked up again. The dog padded to a side window, sniffing along the sill, then pawing at the floorboards. Ethan joined him, sweeping the flashlight low. A faint trail of small footprints, half-filled by snow, led away from the house, toward the slope climbing up into the forest. Beside them were larger boot prints, the pattern uneven, like someone dragging a sled or heavy bag. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Someone had been here, someone who'd known this place. He exhaled slowly, fog clouding the beam of his light. "Come on, Ranger," he said quietly. "We're not done yet." He picked up the diary, slipping it inside his coat. The pages crackled softly against his chest. Outside, the storm screamed through the valley again, and Ethan stepped into it without hesitation, following his partner's tracks through the snow. Behind them, the old cabin creaked in the wind, as if exhaling the last breath of its long-kept secret. The next morning came slowly, a dull gray light pressing through the storm clouds over Snow Vale. The wind had quieted, but the air still stung like glass. Officer Ethan Cole and his loyal K-9 partner, Ranger, stood outside the abandoned cabin, its walls creaking under the weight of new snow. Ethan's thoughts hadn't settled since he'd found the diary, the child's handwriting, the name Emma Parker, the strange freshness of it all. Something about that cabin didn't add up. He spent hours combing the area around the cabin. The snow was uneven, as though something had been dragged or rolled through before the last storm covered it. Ranger sniffed the ground, circling twice before stopping at a patch where the snow had hardened in ridges. Ethan knelt down, brushing it away with a gloved hand. Beneath the crust of ice lay faint grooves, the kind made by a sled or cartwheel. They led north, up toward the darker woods. Still, before following them, Ethan knew he needed answers. He headed back toward the nearest farmhouse on the edge of the valley, a squat wooden house with smoke rising faintly from its chimney. The property belonged to Clara Mason, a woman in her late 60s who had lived in Snowvale her entire life. When Clara opened the door, the warm scent of baked bread and pine sap spilled out. She was small and stooped, her face a map of time and winter sun, with a gentle mouth that always seemed halfway between a smile and a sigh. Ethan removed his hat and nodded politely. "Morning, Clara," he said. "Sorry to bother you this early. I need to ask about that old cabin down the ridge." Her expression faltered the moment he mentioned it. "The Hale place?" she asked softly. Ethan's brow furrowed. "That was its name?" Clara nodded, motioning him inside. "Margaret Hale and her husband built it before the war. He was a logger, big man, kind as a saint. They had a little girl, Emily, sweet child. You'd hear her laughter echo through those woods in summer. Then," she paused, eyes turning distant. 3 years ago, a blizzard came early. They found the husband and the child 2 miles up the ridge, frozen together. Margaret never spoke much after that. She kept to herself, talking to no one. Ethan listened quietly, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug. Clara's voice had the trembling warmth of someone who still carried pity for the broken. "She lived there alone after they passed," Clara continued, "until last Christmas. I saw her one morning loading boxes onto a sled. Didn't say where she was going. Just looked at me and said, 'Emily doesn't like it here anymore.' Then she left. Never saw her again." The hairs on Ethan's arms prickled beneath his coat. The timeline matched perfectly. Margaret Hale had vanished the same night Emma Parker went missing. He thanked Clara and stepped back into the cold. The wind had picked up again, stirring small flurries off the rooftops. Ranger trotted beside him, ears twitching as if sensing his unease. Back at the cabin, Ethan took another slow look around. His flashlight beam slid over the wooden walls, the fireplace, the broken chair, and finally to something he hadn't noticed the night before, a picture frame lying face down beneath the hearth. He brushed the dust away and turned it over. Inside the cracked glass was a photograph, a younger woman with wavy blonde hair, smiling softly, holding a small child with the same golden curls. The corner bore a handwritten note, "Margaret and Emily, Christmas 2019. Ethan stared at it for a long time. The mother's smile was faint, hesitant, but full of warmth, the kind of warmth that could twist into obsession when taken away. "Ranger," he murmured. The dog came closer, tail still. "She lost her daughter. Maybe she found someone else to fill that space." Ranger let out a low whine and began sniffing near the door again. Ethan followed the dog outside, where a faint trail still marked the snow. Ranger's nose pressed against the frozen ground, tracing the pattern northward. At the cabin's corner, a patch of darkened ice caught Ethan's eye, old bobsled tracks nearly erased by wind. He crouched down, gloved fingers brushing the icy grooves. They pointed toward the northern slope, the same direction where the ridge grew steeper. The air carried the faint scent of pine smoke, distant, almost gone, but still there. A shape moved across the white expanse, a lone figure from another farmhouse nearby, pulling a small sled stacked with firewood. Ethan raised a hand to hail him. The man turned, face reddened from the cold, eyes wary but kind. He introduced himself as Harold Finch, a ranch hand in his early 50s, stocky build, round face beneath a wool cap. Ethan asked if he remembered the Hales. Harold nodded grimly. "Yeah, I helped carry the coffins down the ridge after the storm. Poor woman. Couldn't speak for months. Used to come to my wife's bakery sometimes. Bought sugar cookies for the daughter that wasn't there." "Did you see her after last year?" Ethan asked. Harold scratched his beard. "Not after the big snow. But a week later, I found footprints near my property. Small ones like a child's, and another set, heavier, dragging something. Thought it was kids playing, but now I'm not so sure." Ethan's pulse tightened. He thanked Harold and returned toward the tree line. Every piece fit the puzzle too neatly. A grieving widow, a missing girl, and a trail leading into the same cold woods. Back inside the cabin one last time, Ethan stood before the fireplace staring at the faded photo. Ranger sat near the door, tail sweeping the floor slowly. The silence inside was so heavy it felt alive. He thought of his daughter. The way Lily's laughter had filled his house before that Christmas night when everything went dark. He'd tried to bury that sound under work, under patrols, under the endless snow. But now, holding the diary against his chest, the same ache pulsed again. "Maybe she just wanted to be a mother again," he whispered. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching. Then the dog stood, tail straight, nose pointed toward the open doorway. He growled softly. Not out of fear, but focus. Ethan turned. Through the window's frost, faintly visible under the clouded sky, was a trail of frozen mud leading up toward the tree line. Someone had dragged a sled that way recently. The snow around it had a dull brown tint, mixed with old dried leaves and soil from a forest path. Ethan exhaled, the decision already made. He clipped the leash onto Ranger's collar, the metal snapping sharply in the quiet. "Come on, partner," he said. "Let's see where she went." Ranger barked once, a short, confident sound, then trotted forward into the white. Ethan followed, the diary pressed tight inside his coat, the photograph of Margaret and Emily folded into his pocket. Behind them, the wind carried away the last trace of warmth from the abandoned cabin, leaving only silence and the faint, ghostly echo of a child's laughter. The climb up North Hollow was slow and punishing. Snow fell in heavy curtains swirling like ash from an unseen fire. The path narrowed into a trail between thick pine trunks, their branches bending under the weight of ice. Ethan Cole trudged forward, breath frosting against his scarf, one gloved hand gripping the leash while the other steadied the beam of his flashlight. Ranger trotted ahead, his black and silver coat dusted with white, nose low to the ground. The dog's movements were sharp, deliberate. Each pause, sniff, and short bark guided Ethan through the wilderness. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air became. The wind howled through the trees like a choir of ghosts. Ethan's boots crunched over hidden roots and slick stones. Every so often he'd glance back down the slope, the valley of Snowvale now a faint constellation of lights swallowed by snow. He hadn't realized how far he'd come until there was nothing but darkness below and silence above. Halfway up the ridge, Ranger stopped abruptly. The dog's ears twitched, body lowering slightly, tail stiff. Ethan followed his gaze and saw something snagged on a branch just off the path, a small piece of pink fabric, torn and frozen in place. Ethan brushed the snow away and held it up under the beam of his flashlight. It was the corner of a child's mitten, thin and worn, stained with something brown that wasn't just dirt. Beneath it, the snow was disturbed. Two sets of footprints, one small, the other larger and uneven, wound upward into the forest. Ethan crouched beside them, tracing the outlines with his glove. "A woman and a child," he murmured. "You smell it too, don't you, boy?" Ranger sniffed the air, then barked once, a short, low sound. He began pulling the leash north again. Ethan followed, heart tightening with every step. The wind had changed. He could feel the faint trace of warmth in it now, something human. The trail steepened. Ice cracked beneath his boots as he reached the edge of a small clearing. The snow thinned here, giving way to dark earth and pine needles. The air carried new scents: wood smoke, faint sugar, and something else. Cinnamon, maybe. Ranger's head lifted, ears pricked forward. He gave a soft whine, then looked back at Ethan as if to say, "We're close." Through the trees, a faint orange glow shimmered. Ethan crouched behind a fallen log and squinted. Nestled in a cradle of pines stood a small wooden cabin, its windows aglow with candlelight, a thin plume of smoke curling from the chimney. It looked almost peaceful. Too peaceful. Snow blanketed its roof, and a single lantern flickered beside the front door. Ethan turned off his flashlight, the darkness swallowing him whole. His pulse beat slow and heavy in his ears. "Easy, Ranger," he whispered. "Stay low." He drew his sidearm, not to threaten, but to steady himself. His finger rested outside the trigger guard, his breath shallow and measured. The last thing he wanted was panic. Step by step, they crept closer. Ranger moved like a shadow, paws silent on the frozen ground. The closer they got, the clearer the details became: the stacked logs by the wall, a sled leaning against the porch, and faint tracks leading to the door. But what stopped Ethan cold wasn't the sight. It was the sound. Through the soft whistle of wind, a voice drifted out. A woman's voice, trembling, low, and filled with something between sorrow and prayer. Silent night. Holy night. The melody wove through the trees, fragile but hauntingly steady. Ethan's breath caught. The tune carried warmth, but beneath it he heard another sound. A child's voice, faint and wavering, humming along. Ranger tilted his head, ears twitching, tail still. The dog let out a barely audible whine, then looked up at Ethan, eyes glowing amber in the dim light. Ethan crept to the side of the cabin, crouching beneath the window ledge. Frost glazed the glass, but a small patch had melted near the bottom, probably from the heat inside. He wiped it gently with his sleeve and peered through. The sight made his chest tighten. Inside, a woman in her late 40s knelt beside a small wooden table. Her frame was thin, her shoulders slightly hunched, her long blonde hair streaked with silver and tied back with a ribbon. Her face, though lined with years of grief, had a calm, tender glow, illuminated by the flicker of the fire. She wore a faded wool dress patched at the elbows and hummed softly as she held a small girl in her lap. The child couldn't have been older than 7. Her hair was the color of honey, her cheeks pale, eyes tired but wide with trust. She clutched a worn stuffed rabbit and leaned against the woman's chest as they sang together. On the table beside them sat 2 steaming mugs of milk and a plate of gingerbread cookies shaped like stars. Ethan's throat tightened. He'd seen that face before, in the photograph from the cabin below. Margaret Hale. And the girl. There was no mistaking her. The shape of her face, the color of her hair, even the pink glove now missing a corner. Emma Parker. He stayed crouched, heart-pounding, torn between duty and disbelief. The scene inside was almost holy in its quiet simplicity, yet it pulsed with something unsettling. The woman's hand brushed the child's hair with a gentleness that came from deep love. But her eyes, when she turned slightly toward the window, carried a flicker of fear, or perhaps guilt. Ranger growled softly, a low warning sound. Ethan placed a hand on his head to calm him. "Not yet," he whispered. For a few moments he just watched, the firelight dancing across the walls, the warmth inside contrasting with the frozen stillness outside. Then the singing stopped. Margaret stood slowly, carrying the girl toward a small cot by the hearth. She tucked her in beneath a quilt and kissed her forehead. "Sleep, sweetheart," she whispered. "Tomorrow the angels will keep us safe." Emma murmured something Ethan couldn't hear. Margaret smiled faintly, brushing her hair aside. Then, as she turned toward the window again, her gaze shifted, just slightly, as though she sensed something. Her lips parted. Her eyes moved toward the darkness where Ethan hid. He froze, breath caught in his chest. Ranger went still beside him. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then a gust of wind swept through the trees, rattling the shutters, and the woman looked away, returning to the fire. Ethan slowly exhaled. He leaned closer to the dog and whispered, "We found her." Ranger's tail flicked once. The fire inside flickered. Snow continued to fall, quiet as dust as Ethan's mind raced, torn between the image of a criminal and a mother who'd lost everything. Tomorrow would bring questions. But tonight, under the cold sky, one thing was certain. The ghosts of Snowvale were no longer buried. The hinges gave a faint, aching groan as Ethan pushed the door open. The warmth that spilled out was startling. A world of firelight and soft air, so different from the white silence outside. The cabin smelled of pinewood smoke and gingerbread, a sweetness that clung to memory. Ethan stepped quietly inside, one hand steady on his holster but the other already beginning to lower. By the hearth sat a little girl, maybe 7, with hair like spun gold falling in curls over her shoulders. Her small hands moved carefully over folded paper, trying to make a snowflake. She hummed softly to herself, unaware of the stranger watching her. The fire painted her face in amber and rose. Innocent, fragile, utterly alive. Behind her, near the table, stood a woman. Thin, almost ghostly in her frail frame, she wore a faded gray wool dress with sleeves fraying at the edges. Her hair, once golden, was streaked heavily with silver and tied into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. The light caught her eyes. Soft blue once, now flickering between warmth and delirium. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stirred something in a pot over the fire. When she turned, Ethan felt the weight of years collapse into that single moment. Margaret Hale. Her face bore the calm of someone who had wept all her tears long ago. Her eyes, though weary, carried the fierce, desperate tenderness of a mother who had lost the world and rebuilt it out of illusion. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the gentle snore of Ranger, who had sat obediently by the door, his amber eyes never leaving the girl. Then the woman saw Ethan's badge glint faintly in the light. She froze, her hand clutching the wooden spoon as if it were a weapon. "Who are you?" Her voice was soft, yet edged with panic. Ethan raised his empty hand slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said gently. "My name is Ethan. I'm an officer from Snowvale." Her eyes darted toward the girl who had stopped folding her paper snowflake. The child's gaze moved from the man's coat to the dog sitting beside him. She looked confused, but not afraid. Margaret stepped forward, her body trembling as she shielded the girl with her arms. "Please," she whispered, voice cracking. "Don't take her. She's my daughter. She came back to me. Emily came home." The name hit Ethan like a sharp gust of wind. Emily, the name of Margaret's real child, the one who had died in the storm. He took a careful step forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Margaret," he said softly. "That little girl's name is Emma Parker. Her family has been searching for her for a year. She's not Emily." The woman shook her head wildly, eyes brimming with tears. "No," she said, clutching the child tighter. "No, you're wrong. She remembers the song. She called me Mommy when the snow fell. She remembered." Her voice cracked into a sob that twisted through the room like glass shattering. Ethan's throat tightened. He saw the way the girl clung to Margaret's skirt, afraid, but also gentle, as if she understood the sadness around her. Ethan lowered his weapon fully and placed it quietly on the table. "I'm not here to take her from you by force," he said, "but you have to see what's real, Margaret. You've been lost in grief for so long that you've mistaken pain for love." Ranger shifted forward quietly, moving closer to the girl. The dog's presence was grounding, his breath slow, his movement careful. He lowered his head and nudged Emma's hand softly. The girl flinched at first, then smiled weakly, her small fingers brushing his fur. Ethan saw something shift in her eyes, a glimmer of hope, or perhaps recognition that kindness still existed outside the walls of this house. Margaret, meanwhile, backed away slowly toward the fireplace. "I know what the world says," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They think I'm mad. But what would you do, officer, if death took your child? And then one day the snow gave her back?" Ethan looked at her then. Really looked. The question sank into him like a knife turned gently but deeply. He thought of Lily, his daughter, and the Christmas morning 2 years ago when the drunk driver had crossed the lane. The sound of shattering glass, the flash of red and white. For a long time afterward he'd prayed to hear her laughter again in the wind, even for a second. "I'd want to believe it too," he said finally, his voice low and heavy. "But holding on to what's gone, it doesn't bring them back. It only keeps you trapped." Margaret's breathing came uneven now. Her hands trembled, gripping Emma's shoulders as if anchoring herself to the only warmth left in the world. "You don't understand," she murmured. "The house was so quiet. I would sit by the window and wait for Emily to come home from the storm. And then one night I heard crying outside. I opened the door, and there she was. I couldn't let her go." Emma looked up at her with wide eyes. "I'm not Emily," she whispered softly. Her voice was small but clear, like a candle that refused to go out. The words hung between them, fragile as frost. Margaret's body stiffened, her eyes darting to the child's face. Her lips parted, trembling. For a moment, reality cracked through the wall of grief that had cocooned her for a year. Ethan stepped forward, gently now. "You didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said. "You were lost. but it's time to come home." Margaret's gaze flickered between him and Emma, torn between delusion and awakening. She sank slowly to her knees, pulling the girl into one last embrace. "I just wanted her to have a mother," she said, her voice a whisper. Ethan crouched down beside them, his eyes soft. "And you were one," he said quietly. "Maybe not to Emily anymore, but to her. You kept her alive. That means something." For the first time, Margaret's shoulders relaxed. The tension bled from her face, replaced by something gentler. Sorrow, but no longer madness. She brushed the girl's hair from her forehead and kissed it tenderly. "It's time to go home, sweetheart," she whispered. Emma hesitated, then reached for Ranger again. The dog pressed his muzzle against her hand, tail wagging once. The small sound, the jingle of his collar, broke the silence. As Ethan helped Margaret to her feet, his eyes caught something on the far wall. A crayon drawing pinned with a wooden peg. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath falling snowflakes. Above them, in a child's scrawl, were the words, "Mommy and Emily." But someone had added a line beneath, drawn later in shakier pencil. "Now we are 3. Ethan stared at it for a moment, feeling the ache of its simplicity. Margaret followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled faintly, the kind of smile born not of joy but of surrender. Outside, the storm had softened. The wind that once screamed now whispered gently through the pines. Ethan turned toward the door, his coat brushing the floorboards. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you both warm." Margaret nodded slowly. She took Emma's hand, small, trembling, but alive, and followed Ethan toward the open door, where Ranger waited under the falling snow. Snowvale was quieter now. Winter had softened its grip, and even the mountains seemed to breathe easier. Weeks had passed since the night Ethan Cole found the cabin in the pines, and in that time, truth had finally thawed what grief had frozen. Margaret Hale was taken gently from the woods, not in handcuffs but on a stretcher covered with a wool blanket. She hadn't fought when they came. She only looked back once at the small bed where Emma had slept and whispered, "She'll be warm now." Her eyes were tired, yet peaceful. At the Snowvale Psychiatric Ward, Margaret began her treatment under the care of Dr. Lucinda Harris, a woman in her mid-40s with calm gray eyes and the patience of someone who had seen too many souls lost in storms of the mind. She was tall, slim, and carried a presence that mixed firmness with gentleness. In their sessions, Margaret rarely spoke at first. Sometimes she would hum lullabies or draw pictures of snowflakes and small hands holding hers. Dr. Harris didn't interrupt. She just listened, waiting for grief to tire itself out. When Ethan came to testify at the hearing, the courtroom felt heavier than most. The judge, an older man with silver hair and steady eyes, asked him directly, "Officer Cole, in your professional opinion, was there criminal intent in Mrs. Hale's actions?" Ethan stood, uniform crisp but his heart trembling. "No, sir," he replied. "She wasn't driven by malice. She was driven by loss. She didn't kidnap that child to harm her. She was trying to hold on to something love had taken away." His voice cracked slightly, but no one dared interrupt. "Sometimes pain makes people see ghosts in the living." Silence followed, and then a slow nod from the judge. Margaret was committed not as a criminal, but as a patient in need of care. As she was led away, she caught Ethan's eye and smiled faintly, that fragile, forgiving smile of someone who'd finally laid down her burden. Emma was reunited with her real parents 2 days later. The reunion took place in Milford, the neighboring town that had prayed for a miracle for a year. The townsfolk gathered along the main street as the ambulance rolled in through falling snow. Lanterns hung from every porch, flickering like stars. The Parkers, a young couple with kind faces weathered by sorrow, rushed forward as the door opened. Emma ran into their arms, her red sweater bright against the gray day. The mother wept soundlessly, her fingers trembling as she touched her daughter's hair again. The father, broad-shouldered and quiet, lifted Emma high, his tears lost in the snow. From the edge of the crowd, Ethan stood beside Ranger, his hat held against his chest. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. The moment belonged to them, and to Grace itself. When the town's church bells began to ring, someone in the crowd whispered, "A Christmas miracle." And for the first time in years, Ethan found himself agreeing. A year passed. Seasons changed. The forest thawed, the rivers broke free, and life, in its quiet way, began again. Ethan stayed on the force, though he took fewer night patrols. He spent more time in his small house at the edge of town, fixing things that didn't need fixing, talking to Ranger as if the dog could answer. The framed photograph of Lily, his daughter, remained on the mantel, beside the silver badge he no longer polished. That December, on the anniversary of the rescue, Ethan found a letter in his mailbox. It was written in uneven handwriting, folded neatly into a red envelope. "Dear Officer Ethan, thank you for finding me and helping Miss Margaret. Mommy says you're an angel that God sent when we needed one. Ranger, too. Can you come visit us this Christmas? Love, Emma Parker." Ethan read it twice, his throat tightening. Ranger nudged his knee, tail flicking gently. "Guess we've got somewhere to be, partner," he murmured. On Christmas Eve, he drove through Milford again. The streets were lined with lights the same as last year, only brighter. When he reached the Parker home, a white farmhouse with garlands on the porch, the door opened before he could knock. Emma ran out in her red sweater, curls bouncing, and threw her arms around him. "Dad, Ethan!" she exclaimed. "I told Mommy you'd come." Ethan froze for a moment, breath catching in his chest. The words hit him like sunlight after years of shadow. He crouched down, smiling through tears he didn't bother to hide. "You can call me that if you want," he whispered. Ranger barked softly, tail wagging as Emma bent to hug his neck. The little girl laughed, and for a heartbeat, everything was whole again. Inside, the Parkers welcomed him like family. The house glowed with candles and the scent of cinnamon. A Christmas tree sparkled near the window, its ornaments a mix of old memories and new beginnings. On one branch hung a small pair of pink gloves, worn but carefully preserved. Ethan reached out and touched them gently. "You kept them," he said softly. Emma nodded. "Mommy said they belong here, like memories that found their way home." Later that evening, when everyone had gone to bed, Ethan sat by the tree. The fire cracked softly, and Ranger lay beside him, muzzle resting on his boots. He pulled from his pocket an old photo, Lily smiling in the snow, and set it beside the gloves. For the first time, the memory didn't hurt. It warmed. He whispered into the quiet room, "2 daughters, huh? Guess heaven really does send second chances." Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle, slow, and luminous under the glow of street lamps. The night was so still he could almost hear the faint chime of church bells from the town below. And in that sound, Ethan felt something stir. Not sorrow, not longing, but peace. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. "Lord, thank you for turning loss into love, for making broken hearts find each other again, and if there's anyone out there lost in the snow tonight, guide them home." The world seemed to answer with silence, the good kind, the kind that carries promise. Outside the window, the lights shimmered on the snow like fallen stars. Inside, beneath the tree, a man, a dog, and a memory sat together, proof that light, once found, never truly goes out. Sometimes God doesn't erase our pain. He transforms it into purpose. He sends the right people at the right time to remind us that love never truly dies. It only changes form. This Christmas, remember to cherish those you hold close, forgive those you've lost, and open your heart to miracles. They often come quietly, like snow. If this story touched your heart, Share it with someone who believes in second chances. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment about how you feel, and may God bless you and your family this Christmas.